Howdy again everyone, and after testing nearly 300 lenses on this YouTube channel over the years, I'm pleased to present you with the first ever 75mm lens I've ever even touched, the brand new Samyang AF 75mm f1.8. It's for Sony's mirrorless E-mount cameras, full frame or APS-C, and it costs $400 in the US or £380 in the UK. A very reasonable price if the lens turns out to be any good. I'd like to thank Samyang's UK distributor for loaning me this lens for a week for testing, although as usual this is a totally independent review. I'll be looking at both its strengths and any weaknesses it might have. From my perspective, the photography world is screaming out for more small-sized, full-frame lenses for mirrorless cameras, and that's why I've found Samyang's new tiny but mighty lenses pretty exciting so far. In fact, I named their awesome little 18mm f2.8 full-frame lens as one of my favourites that I've tested of all time. So it's great to see them zooming in a bit now to 75mm while keeping that general small-sized philosophy alive and well. 75mm is quite an interesting focal length really, that you don't normally get on anything other than Leica rangefinder cameras. It's really user-friendly actually, easily telephoto enough for some great portrait shots, but obviously a bit wider angle than the more common 85mm lenses, making it a little bit easier to use and making your backgrounds a little more involved than they would be on a lens with a tighter field of view. And a maximum aperture of f1.8 is plenty wide enough for fast shutter speeds and nicely out of focus backgrounds. This may be a small lens, but especially as a full frame instrument, it has some nice photographic potential. So let's take a look at the lens's build quality first. As I mentioned, it's small and metallic, being based on a metal lens mount, albeit without any weather sealing gasket. It's very lightweight, tipping the scales at only 230 grams. Here it is next to Sony's 50mm f1.8 FE lens, which is barely any smaller and lighter itself. A new feature for one of these small Samyang lenses is that the main control ring is customizable. If you switch it onto mode 1, then it works as a focus ring. You have to set your camera to manual focus or DMF mode to use it in that way, but it works pretty responsively if you do. If you switch the lens to custom mode 2, then that focus ring will control your aperture instead, which some people might prefer. The control ring turns reasonably smoothly, although as you can see here, that doesn't mean your aperture changes while shooting video will be perfectly smooth, although it is better than most other lenses in that regard. I should tell you now that no matter what the lens's switch was set to, if I was shooting video in manual focus mode on the camera, then the control ring would only perform manual focusing and not aperture changes. Oh, and here's the lens's focus breathing. As you can see, when you focus more closely, the lens zooms in as you do so. Here is the lens's autofocus motor at work. It makes a very quiet clicking sound as it locks onto your subject, which is nothing you'll hear in real life, but your camera's microphone might pick it up when you're shooting video. The autofocus works only averagely quickly. It is accurate, but it has a slight tendency to hunt, so it might not be a great option for shooting sports events or any kind of fast-moving subject. I did test it with my camera's eye autofocus feature by the way, and it worked great. The lens's filter size is 58mm in diameter, and it comes with the usual caps and a lens hood. Overall, its build quality is very nice, and the option for aperture control there is quite handy too, although its focus system is slightly on the slow side. More important though is image quality. I'll start by testing it on a Sony a7R II with its full frame 42MP sensor. Straight from f1.8, sharpness and contrast in the middle of the image are great, although just shy of perfection. The further good news is that the image quality holds out pretty well in the image corners too, looking only a little bit softer but still capturing a lot of detail. Stop down to f2.8 for a nice little improvement in sharpness and contrast in those corners, and back in the middle, the image quality has become absolutely razor sharp. Stop down to f4 and the middle is just as good of course, but the corners don't really see much of a further improvement yet. f5.6 is the same again, but f8 and f11 do see small little improvements. So overall, on a full frame camera, the middle of your images will always look fantastically sharp, and the image corners only slightly less so. So that's a pretty great performance for this little lens. Now let's see how it performs on an APS-C camera by testing it on my 24 megapixel Sony a5100. Straight from f1.8, sharpness is brilliant in the middle of the image. The corners look fairly soft though. f2.8 looks about the same there, but f4 is sharper. f5.6 and f8 both look excellent. Don't stop your aperture down too far though. f16 and f22 will look really quite soft due to the effect of diffraction. So on an APS-C camera, the lens remains fantastically sharp in the middle of your images, but the corners are a bit weaker at wide apertures. Stop down to f5.6 though for some very impressive results. Now let's take a look at distortion and vignetting on a full frame camera. These images are taken without any in-camera corrections. As you can see, we are treated to a very small amount of pincushion distortion. The corners look noticeably dark at f1.8, but stop down to f2.8 or f4 and they brighten up well enough. Now let's see about close-up image quality. The lens's minimum focus distance is 69 centimeters, not very close really. At the widest aperture of f1.8, we see some good detail being captured, but contrast is low and there's some color fringing too. However, stop down to f2.8 and you'll see absolutely brilliant image quality, so if you're shooting up close, stop down your aperture a little for best results. Now let's see how the lens works against bright lights. It's just an average performance here, with a fair amount of flaring and glaring to be seen. It'll be a good idea to use the lens's hood. As I mentioned earlier, this lens can get you nicely out of focus backgrounds at f1.8, so let's take a look at its bokeh. The quality of those backgrounds is a little hit and miss. Deeply out of focus backgrounds, as you see here, look lovely and smooth. More difficult backgrounds that are closer to your subject can look a bit busy. Related to bokeh is longitudinal chromatic aberration. At f1.8 we see plenty of it in a colourful bokeh highlighting. But the great news is that you only need to stop down to f2.8 to see it virtually gone. Overall then, well, this is an extremely likeable lens for a number of reasons. Its small size, low price, solid build quality, sharp image quality, and enjoyable 75mm focal length all make it a little bit of a winner. It's not an optically perfect lens by any means, and I wish it focused more closely for getting pictures of smaller subjects. But for the price you're paying, you can't complain here at all, really. Its most obvious competition on a Sony system, I think, is the Sony FE 85mm f1.8 lens. The Sony lens is much bigger and heavier and about $200 more, but it gives you a tighter perspective, which some will prefer for portrait photography, and it's a tiny bit sharper in its image corners too, with slightly softer bokeh. Another competing lens is the very good Viltrox 85mm f1.8. The differences there are that the Viltrox lens is a bit cheaper than the Sony, but not quite as sharp. But really, this 75mm Samyang optic is a brilliant and handy little lens, which also manages to be great fun to use, and so it definitely comes recommended.